do that one too. It's a good crowd tonight. It's probably the biggest crowd I've spoken in front of, so bear with me. And also for a designer, I do a lot of talking, so my voice is a little bit shaky at the moment because I've been talking all day and I've signed myself up for even more of that. Thank you. There we go. So this is a story I'm going to tell you tonight. It's an experience that happened about 5 years ago, but it's pretty relevant. The quote of the title was from someone called Marshall McLuhan. Yeah, he's a great source for quotes. This is another one. And we shape our tools, and afterwards our tools shape us. But sometimes we need to stop replicating old methods with our new tools. Have you ever had a feeling that a project you're working on is just fighting the last war? There's something not quite right about what they're doing. This is a story about how I changed the medium to hopefully affect our thinking. But before I get into that story, I want to tell you about the industry I work in. So I work for a consultancy called Lab 49, and we specialise in capital markets. This story happens well before I worked for Lab 49. I was working in London. But a little bit about capital markets for those of you who don't know. It's basically our economy. It's vast. So each day, $6 trillion of foreign exchange is traded. 2.7 trillion in interest rate derivatives. Don't worry if you don't know what they are, but it's a big number. In Australia, in 2015, the turnover was 135 trillion worth traded. So you can imagine there's a lot going on. It's also fast. You might have heard this story. A company in the US, a private company, spent $300 million digging a tunnel through rock from New York to Chicago, setting up servers across the road from the exchange to save 3 milliseconds. So if you think about that, they spent $300 million for 3 milliseconds. It was pretty big spending back in the day too. So Morgan Stanley, their Matrix platform, they believe it was about $100 million spending. They won't confirm, but that's the rumours. And you can see there by that picture as well that it's sometimes pretty complex and the interfaces are pretty busy and there's a lot going on. And frankly, that's why I joined the industry. I looked at that and I thought, I'm up for a challenge, that looks hard. It's also expensive to access. So the Bloomberg terminals, which were dominating for a long time, $20,000 plus subscription annually to access. So you can imagine it's a lot of barriers for people to work in the industry. It has all the screens. They're pretty hectic places, some of the trading floors. I've seen up to 10 or 12 screens. People have 2 phones on their desk. They have PA systems, 2 keyboards. It's hectic. They usually have laptops as well. They have multiple machines, so they're going to have enough cards to run everything. But not everything is like that. We have to cater everything from mobile through to 10 to 12 screens at a time. It was massive. The top one was before 2008. The bottom one was after. I was actually working in a place, I joined just after 2008, so again, challenge. Economy's crashing, they're sacking everyone. Great industry to jump into. What happened though, at about that time, there was a platform war. So I really like this framework, peace, war and wonder. So in times of peace, mature markets, things are pretty stable, but stability breeds inertia. Something happens to jog that out, usually technology, maybe a market crash, combination of the few. And the status quo is disrupted. Usually there's a fight for survival. Some people don't know they're in a fight for survival, and it's usually played on the old rules. And at some point, someone figures it out, and wonder emerges. It's new activities emerge based on new rules and new points of value. So, the challenge. The project I was on, we were challenged to deliver the following. Create a platform that was flexible and adaptable. we're responsive to customers' changing demands. And remember, very, very demanding customers. Everyone from medium, large businesses up through to very professional. Create common tools and components. So think very, very extensive design libraries. A rich UI, and allowed third parties to contribute to the ecosystem. So, they wanted to do a fair bit. We'd settled into a bit of a structure. I was part of the platform team. We served a number of product teams, and then we had distributed teams across the bank relying on the work that we did. And, the roles were roughly divided between what I like to call the settlers and town planners. So the town planners and the platform team, our job was to industrialise the application, industrialise the platform, and enable the commonalities and make it more powerful and scalable. And of course, we were working with the product teams who were the settlers, establishing the applications and working off the requirements. So after a few months, we'd settled that in, things were going, we're starting to deliver, but not everything was awesome. The apps that were being built and being defined, so we had multiple apps being built on a platform, think like a little mini app store. They were defined by the organisational structure. They were defined by the product teams, so they followed the existing product structures. We didn't think that they were thinking about how the industry was evolving. And remember, this was at a time of massive change. And they weren't really thinking about how the customers might evolve as well. They were really just looking at about how people currently use things. And I had a thought, were we just making it easier to deliver the same functionalities more efficiently? And is that really what we want? Were we just gluing the Lego bricks together for convenience, but limiting the creativity and flexibility that we're after? There's another role to play apart from the settlers and the town planners, and that was the pioneer. So one of the things that we needed to do is also become pioneers. So what does a pioneer do? They act in ambiguity, in uncharted waters. They have to challenge the assumptions of the project. They prototype novel ideas, and they seek to make future success possible. So you can kind of see here where you've got pioneers feeding into settlers, or even there's actually a flow the other way where they steal from. So settlers look at what the pioneers are doing and saying, hey, we want some of that, and we'll use those ideas and use those resources, and then feeding into town planners. So as a pioneer, I had to think, how could I challenge the status quo and explore what might come next? So we're fighting the war. What might actually lead us into the next stage? So many activities occurred. One of them was prototyping a conversational UI. Just for some context, we had some key challenges that apart from just those ones I mentioned, when you've got the very complex screens, people have got all these different windows, tracking prices, tracking charts, news. You are fighting for attention. And the way that a lot of traders sometimes think about their screens is every space, every inch of my screen has to be worth something $2 million. It's an opportunity cost for me to remove something else and put your thing on there. So imagine when people are spending hundreds of millions of dollars or even tens of millions of dollars to develop functionality, it's pretty cutthroat. So we had this problem of how do we get ourselves noticed? How do we go from number 3, 4, 5 in the industry and move our way up the chain and serve customers' needs better? So this idea started with a conversation in Spanish. So I was learning Spanish at the time. One of my colleagues was from Spain, and in a discussion we were talking about how to categorize and how to think about some of the design systems. I started to learn more about Spanish, and I had to relearn English in order to really learn Spanish. So I had to understand structures, nouns and verbs a lot better. So I thought, could I map the grammar, the structure of our entire ecosystem? And actually, I did that without really knowing where it would take me. Then I thought, well, couldn't I turn this into a conversational UI? And I thought, well, to do that, I'd have to break everything down to its smallest, lightest parts, most temporal common elements. So that's what I did. I mapped out all of the nouns and verbs. So imagine nouns are, they're the objects you're acting on, and the verbs are the actions you do to them in the most simplest sense. And what it did is it gave us, for the first time, it seems so simple, the first time, a complete view of the ecosystem. And it also meant that when people said, hey, look, my case is unique, we can point to it and say, it is or it isn't. We can say, we've already got that noun there, we've already got that verb there, we know what that does. Is it really actually new? What it also did is that we were able to map out in the ecosystem linguistic structures. We could actually almost have phrases. And for those of you familiar with job stories, we didn't know it at the time, but when we started to phrase these out about these things that were happening, they sound a lot like job stories. So, it was a really radical shift in constraints, going from something a bit like the top one. That wasn't the actual one. I can't show you the one that we did. In this industry, the NDAs are very, very strictly enforced. But the idea was to turn something as complex as the one at the top, and even more so, into conversational UI. Of course, I can't show you the real stuff. It was pretty rudimentary, as they should be when they're a prototype. But when I look at it now, it really resembled Slack. We had the ability to call an app. You can sit there and say, I want to call this specific functionality in this specific app and do something. You can call that noun and that verb. You can trigger actions. You had syntaxes and syntax commands. And also it would bring back controls and charts and other simple things in the flow. So what did we learn from this? Turning something as complex and over time the designers really only thought in complex screens. They had to fit things in and find a place for a button and the sort of current paradigm into this new one. Well, pretty quickly you learn you can't have a button for everything. So you have to solve that one. Not everything will be in view. You have to think about time and space more. You have to think about what needs to be shown here at this time, and it might not be the same thing that's shown there a second or a few seconds later. Also space. It's a little bit like the mobile first principle. Those constraints make you think about applications in more dimensions. Your existing silos, the logic that the bank used to not only structure but specify what they and wrap the business cases around were challenged. Naturally, when you started to think like this, the barriers of the apps broke down, and the flows and those jobs, you can easily see how they just go through different applications. You needed to have a holistic understanding, because we're now talking about the ecosystem, we're now talking about the whole thing. You needed to know not just how it was represented in your app, in your little slice. You had to know about the whole piece of the pie. And we also learnt not everything is suitable. There's a lot of things you just cannot put into that format. It's amazing how much you can do, but you have to think about jumping off points. At what point does the conversation really stop and you have to say, okay, I'm going to hand you over to something more capable now. But what that did was, when you do that handover, it's in a much better context. You can inject people into very specific places and target more strongly the job they're trying to do. And that was our initial lessons, but most importantly, how our thinking changed. So one of the big things, and these points I realised only earlier today when I was reviewing it, actually all build on each other. So we learnt about discoverability. You have to be able to discover what the capabilities of the system are. And when you've got something so complex that's operating across multiple products, you can trade things in multiple ways. And you're not just doing, you're not just trading, you're doing CRM, you're doing account management, it's sales, it's analytics, it's all bundled into one. There's a good quote by someone called Ben Evans, and he said the optimum number of capabilities are one or everything. Anything else in between, you've got some tricky aspects. And what he means by that is, if you've got one capability, then you know how to command it. Lights on, lights off. If it can do everything, like hell, you can just talk to it and it will understand. But the state of the industry at the moment is we're trying to act in the middle, and you've got a discoverability problem. There is an additional mental load to understand what this thing can do and how you can ask it to do things and what you can't ask it to do. And this is one of the problems with something like Siri, is that a lot of the time you don't really remember exactly what it does. But it's also one of the benefits of something like the Echo, where it's much more easily communicated what it does. People understand a little bit more. They play this music, buy washing detergent. Also, you need to. So it works better in a domain with confined constraints. And we're a little bit of both. We had a very, very broad application with lots of different things, lots of potential commands, lots of nouns and verbs. But we were able to identify the elements of that ecosystem that were best suited to interacting that way. And most importantly, discoverability doesn't necessarily have to be there on the screen in front of you. And this is something that we realised, and again, it's so obvious in retrospect, that when you take away a lot of the UI, you realise how much of that navigation in the UI is actually just for telling the users what it can do. The traders are fairly used to using commands and doing these sorts of things. I hope you can see the keyboard there. This is one of the keyboards that some traders use. You can see there's a lot more buttons than usual. There's actually 3 screens on the keyboard as well. But the yellow buttons and the green buttons are quick commands to be able to jump through to a command or be able to execute something very quickly. So our users in this field were fairly used to doing this already. But when I talk about discoverability flows from context, the logical place we ended up in is thinking about, well, how do we anticipate what people want and start to be much more proactive about what we serve up to them? And it changed that thinking from, I'll just put the button on the screen and be passive and wait for them to click it, to I need to think more about what they're going to need and what are the things that will tell me what they need. So you then start to think about, well, the paths that we create for the users should adapt. They should actually expand over time as well as you add more capabilities. And this is one of the key things when you're building a platform or an ecosystem, that you start off with a set of capabilities and it's not static. It grows, it changes. We needed to learn new skills. We needed to have a new language to talk about conditional states and flow and be able to not only talk about that with our stakeholders, but be able to map that out. And it started to change our assumptions about how we built and integrate applications. So rather than doing a whole application at a time, specifying a whole lot of requirements, a little bit waterfall, designing the application, looking at the screen and seeing how we fit all these things in, you start to think about, well, if I'm going to design this verb or this noun, I want to try and do it once. And then whenever I encounter that thing, I can start to take advantage of the existing capabilities, but then plan for those capabilities to grow over time. So then you think about, we need to design systems, not destinations. So it allows us to move from that linear connections, those linear journeys, through to flowing configurations. And you can imagine if you're used to mapping out journeys in even like a fairly hierarchical or linear way, you start to think about flow. And those of you in service design, this will be very familiar to you about flow in different contexts. And it emphasised that apps aren't screens. And one of the things you often hear is people, and particularly people who aren't that sort of knowledgeable in this area, is they start to use apps and screens interchangeably or templates. And when you're using this type of model, you realise how that breaks down. They don't need to be a single thing. They don't need to be something we have to go to and open and then only get one view. They can be something we can call through a Alexa. They can be something we can call through a plug-in to a browser, or any number of ways. So the primary way of interacting with your app may not actually be through what you think is your app. You might actually be designing an API. You may be designing algorithms that is then utilised by someone else. You might be designing the functions. So you get to the point where you think, well, no more cathedrals. We're not building something that represents your particular business. That breaks down. It's just bazaars. It's building on top of each other, and these conversations building on each other, and the capabilities building on each other in any number of ways that is much more responsive to the individual and the context and the time and what's going on outside the individual in the context. So we had to think much more about modularity, because if you're going to be adaptable, you need some level of modularity. And we have to think also about, if you add new capabilities, you do something new, you add a new noun or a verb to the system, that you shouldn't need to redesign things. And this was one of the big blockers we had in the project, that you had to either have foresight about all of the ways that you're going to do something, or you had to spend a lot of money changing things. The flow of conversations should get more intelligent, and we had to think about how do we actually cater for those changing experiences where all of a sudden you've got a new capability, a new thing you can do. And you also need to start to think about how the other partners in the ecosystem might feed into that. So they might start to develop their capability or add things in ways that you don't expect, and that's the nature of a platform. And if you have something that is very complex in its design and very rigid and is a high barrier for you to create something that can exist in that world, that's a high barrier for anyone to participate in your platform. Whereas if you have it in a conversational UI, or you start to consider these things, as we did, broken down into nouns and verbs with very common, consistent behaviour, and scaling intelligence, you give people a lot more paths to contribute, and it's a lot easier. They can just develop a function, they can just develop an algorithm that helps something that is existing. They might be able to map new paths. So, a closing thought, and this is another McLuhan quote. It's the framework which changes with each new technology, and not just the picture within the frame. So, don't just focus on the artifact. Don't just do things in the same way that you have done them. And don't think about, I'm building a complex platform, therefore I've only got one way to build it. Or I am building this thing for this industry, and this is how they work. Start to observe the changing structures, the changing messages and the changing mediums that affect the myths and mindsets. Challenge those, and you can basically move the game from that war to the wonder, and find new sources of value. Thank you very much.
Thanks
Thanks, Jay. Now we have time for questions. Does anyone have a question? I have a couple in my pocket, but who wants my questions? There's the hand. No? Well, I'll kick one up. One here.
Are you able to give an example of something you could do within that conversational influence space? Like, what's the standard?
Yep. I'll also
legal repercussions.
Yeah, I can talk about generalities. So I'll bring that one back up again. So a couple of things we did do is some really random examples, but we targeted some of the things that were on the mind of the team at the time. So one of them was onboarding. How do I onboard someone onto this platform and give them a certain set of rights? And so you're able to type in just like enable so-and-so with these rights, and it will come back and just say enabled. Now that doesn't sound that special, but previously you think about how many steps. You would have to open up the app. You'd have to go in, locate their name, go through, locate the permissions, start to check things on, hit confirm, and it got confirmed. So that was a very, very simple case, and we were able to do that very quickly. Another one was we were able to run some analytics software that returned charts, a bit like one of the examples there, and you would be able to feed in some data. It would do some cost analysis on the transactions and come back to you and give you a chart and see whether how much you're paying for certain transactions and whether they were sort of above or below average. And then it would give you some options that you can continue on into a further analysis, or you can share it, export it out, or share it with someone. So that is very much like that example there. That previously required many, many more steps. Even just launching apps. So one of the ideas was to have this and we built this little widget that was on your home screen. We did one that sat in Chrome, one on a mobile. We tried all different locations. That you can just launch applications, but launch very specific things. So I want a ticket to, I'm using a little bit of jargon here, but I want a ticket to trade $10 million of Aussie US in 3 days time. And it cut the time just to get that down to, you just type that in really quickly or speak it. At the time we didn't have the language algorithms available that you do now, so we were doing it through typing, and we kind of faked a little bit of the speaking. And it would come up and you could just, a few more clicks and you're ready to go. Now that's really important because the traders need to be very responsive, and also they, as I mentioned before, they don't want all these tickets sitting on their screen blocking up potentially much more valuable information that could cost them millions and millions of dollars. Got lots.
I just want to make sure I'm not into the street over.
Hi Jay, thanks for that. I had two kind of questions, maybe they're related. How did your users' behaviour change over time, from when you first launched it to when they got used to it? And what sort of personality did you inject into your system response?
In terms of, I'll answer the second one first. In terms of personality, very little. One of the reasons is that at the time, all of the nice open source libraries that you've got now to parse natural language, to be able to understand it and to be able to talk back, weren't available. So we were having to basically create a lot of language trees, and as complex as we can make it. So it was pretty robotic. But that actually for our users was exactly right. It wasn't meant to be friendly, that it was about business. I need to do this, I need to do it now, and the quicker I can do it and move on, the better. In terms of how they changed, it was less about sort of actually putting it into their workflow, because the point we're at here was we were trying to shape what this product was and trying to shape the expectations for the program. So it was more actually targeted towards the stakeholders, the people who made the decisions and shaped the program, to say, think about what you're doing a little bit differently to what you are. We did actually show some people and they got it, but one of the things I also learnt was that when you're doing pretty rough prototypes with fairly rigid, at the time, structures, no matter how good you Wizard of Oz it, it doesn't quite feel real for them at the time. It was much more about setting up the mental change in actually mapping out the ecosystem than it was changing behaviour of the end users. There's one here.
Did anyone make any $1 million mistakes typing the wrong thing?
Oh yeah. No, so it was only ever in sort of test beds and sandboxes. So no, but people do that in tickets all the time. They do it in trades all the time. You can back it out. But then that's, of course, with all the regulations, that's recorded and you have to justify it, and sometimes that causes flow-on effects in the market. But thankfully this was just all hypothetical, but since I will mention, a company called Symphony has introduced something. They recently got $65 million worth of funding for something very, very similar, secure messaging for the financial industry, and they're starting to do it, but they're not doing trading through that yet. And that's one of the things we did actually prototype trading scenarios, but it is so carefully managed and regulated, you have to be very careful what you do. But there is a thing, Bloomberg has chats, and what you can actually do, and one of the things we did actually plug it into, is when traders chat by Bloomberg, or even people asking a trader to do a trade, you can basically just extract what they say out of there, drop it into the window of this conversational UI, parse it, and then bring up a ticket straight from that chat. Yeah, we were kept well away from the actual money flows on this one.
So did it actually, is it in production? Or did they park it?
No, they parked it. And that's a whole other story. But one of the things that has happened since is that we're seeing more and more of this in the industry. I think it was a few years too early. The concept, we went further with the concept. The idea of breaking it down and all of those other points I mentioned at the end, they're all now much more standard in the industry. We're working on some ideas where you, in order to meet some of the regulations, particularly in the US, of presenting something a bit like a chat, conversational flow, to recreate the conditions of when you did a trade. So if someone said, okay, when you did that trade, what was the customer doing, what did they ask for, what was their position, and the more we can actually design things almost like a conversation now, the better we can recreate things to send to regulators. What I've also noticed is it's much, much better for CRM as well. You can actually start to have CRM trading and other things all merged into one. So it's not actually implemented like a actual chatbot, but we're using conversational principles now for very diverse reasons.
But yep. It's great. I kept my talking down to a minimum, so you guys can ask more questions.
It's a little bit related to the last question, but when the stakes are so high and you can't how many
What do you mean by cutting corners?
you make it faster for them. So if I was a trader, I wouldn't want to
Yeah.
so I want to actually set them the right way.
Yes, that's the flip side to one of the points I made before, where I said, one of the things in the interface is it tells you about what it can do. One of the other things it does is it gives you trust, because it has all that information around there that gives context, but you can check what else is happening. One example is you'll notice in some of the earlier photos, sometimes the screens are full of blue and red colours, and you've got all the charts in the different colours. And a lot of the time they're not actually looking at the details, they're just looking for changes, sometimes peripheral vision, and then they zoom in. And that sort of stuff is actually, in some cases, really valuable to validate that you're doing the right thing. And you implement things in tickets like a mode for just quoting versus actual trading, and we have to change the whole look and feel so it's very obvious what you're doing. Some of the buttons you present back when you're trading can have half a dozen or more states. It's not just hover, click. They have many, many more states. So you can do some things like that, but what we actually found was it was much more powerful for analytics, CRM, opening applications, getting to the place you need so then you can trade. So you're saying, well, maybe trading's not a good idea because of the risk and the trust, but I can get to that trading window already configured, ready to go, and then presents me with those other parts of the picture that gives me that trust much more quickly. So that was where I was mentioning the jumping off point. Sometimes the jumping off points still utilise the same capability we had in the conversational aspect of it, but then you realise at what point you need to transition and bring in other information. So it was that balance between what is appropriate and what isn't, and we definitely found out that not everything is, but in this conceptual stage we just threw everything at it and said, well, let's see what happens.
One last one. Would it be fair to say that it's almost an advanced scripting system that's driven by natural language?
Yes.
So you're grouping a number of commands together.
Yes, so in some things it's a little bit more open, and we looked at ways of doing some of the subject, object, verbs in different combinations in the scripting. With current technology, you can be much more loose than that, and with some of the natural language processing, it's very easy now for machines to understand what you're saying. It's a lot harder to understand what you mean, but we kept it pretty structured. And some of the tasks you can do a fairly semi-structured, and then you can start to add more and more structure. So say if you're copying in something from Bloomberg, that will be highly structured. So we can get you a lot further into the journey. Where something's semi-structured, you have to take a guess and say, okay, well, this is what we think you're now looking for, and you can now imagine that current technologies, AI, machine learning, can improve that, and when you present information can actually do like a fuzzy association to say, you've asked for this, but we now can also determine that you need these other things and provide many more onward journeys as well.
Thanks, Jay. Everyone, please thank Jay Whittaker.
Thank you.